A homeless girl hands a baby to a millionaire and says, "This is your son." He is stunned, and when he takes a DNA test, he discovers something that will leave you speechless. Subscribe to the channel to support my work and comment which city you live in. The autumn wind whipped through the empty streets of Denver's affluent Highland neighborhood as 6-year-old Clara trudged forward, her bare feet numb against the cold concrete. In her arms, she cradled her baby brother Lucas, wrapped in a threadbare blanket that did little to shield him from the biting cold. Her own tattered dress offered no protection, but she barely noticed the chill anymore. Her focus was solely on the sprawling brick mansion ahead. Clara had memorized this address, repeating it like a prayer during the endless days and nights on the streets. 2487 Highland Drive. This was her last hope. Her mother's final words echoed in her mind. "Find Christopher Morgan. He lives in Highland. He can give Lucas a better life." Now, after weeks of searching, she stood before the wrought iron gates that protected his home from the world. The security camera swiveled toward her as she pressed the intercom button. Her heart pounded, but she forced her voice to remain steady. "I need to speak with Mr. Morgan. Please, it's about his son." Moments later, a tall man in his early 40s appeared at the gate. Christopher Morgan's presence was imposing. His tailored suit and stern expression spoke of wealth and power. But Clara didn't flinch. She had endured too much to back down now. "This is your son," she declared, lifting Lucas slightly higher. "My mother said you needed to know." Christopher's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. "That's impossible. Who are you? Where are your parents?" "My name is Clara. My mother..." Her voice caught for a moment before she steadied it. "She's gone, and Lucas needs his father." Christopher studied the sleeping baby's face, his skepticism evident. Yet something in Clara's determined stance made him pause. After a long moment, he pressed a button, and the gates slowly opened. "Come inside," he said, his tone careful and measured. "We need to sort this out." Clara followed him into the mansion, her bare feet leaving dirty marks on the pristine marble floor. The warmth hit her like a wave, making her realize just how cold she'd been, but she couldn't relax. Not yet. Everything depended on what happened next. In the brightly lit kitchen, Christopher poured himself a glass of water, then offered one to Clara. She accepted it with trembling hands but didn't drink. She'd learned to be cautious, even when desperate. "How did you find me?" Christopher asked, his voice softer now as he noticed her exhaustion. "Mom said you owned the grocery stores. The big ones. I asked people until someone told me where you lived." Clara's voice was matter-of-fact, betraying none of the fear and uncertainty that had plagued her journey. Christopher ran a hand through his graying hair. "And your mother? Who was she?" "Sarah Martinez." Clara watched his face carefully, looking for any sign of recognition. His expression remained neutral, but his fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around his glass. "I need to make some calls. A DNA test." He paused, seeming to remember he was talking to a child. "We need to make sure about Lucas and find someone to help you." Clara's grip on Lucas tightened. "I don't need help. I just need to know he'll be safe." Christopher studied her. This tiny girl with adult eyes who had somehow found her way to his door. Despite his reservations, he couldn't send her back into the cold night. Not yet. "You can stay in the guest room tonight," he said finally. "We'll figure this out in the morning." The housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, appeared as if summoned. Her eyes widened at the sight of Clara and the baby, but she quickly composed herself. Christopher gave her quiet instructions about preparing rooms and finding clean clothes. As Mrs. Chen led Clara upstairs, Christopher pulled out his phone. His fingers hovered over the keypad as he debated whom to call first, his lawyer or child services. The situation demanded immediate action, but something held him back. The way Clara had looked at him, with that mixture of hope and defiance. In the guest room, Clara sat on the edge of the massive bed, still holding Lucas. Mrs. Chen had brought clean clothes and offered to help her bathe, but Clara had refused to let go of her brother. Now, in the quiet room, her careful composure began to crack. Her mother's face flashed through her mind, pale and drawn in those final days, whispering Christopher's name like a lifeline. Clara hadn't told him everything. Not about the endless nights in the shelter, or the days without food, or the terror of watching Lucas grow weaker while she could do nothing to help. She looked down at her sleeping brother, touching his soft cheek. "I promised Mom I'd save you," she whispered, "no matter what." Downstairs, Christopher paced his study, unable to shake the feeling that there was more to Clara's story than she'd revealed. He'd known many women named Sarah, but something about the name Martinez tugged at his memory. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft cry from upstairs. Lucas had awakened. As he climbed the stairs, Christopher heard Clara's gentle voice singing a lullaby in Spanish. The same lullaby his grandmother used to sing. He stopped outside the door, listening, as an impossible thought began to form in his mind. The question was, could he trust what Clara was telling him? And more importantly, what would he do if it turned out she was lying? Morning light filtered through the heavy curtains of the guest room, where Clara sat cross-legged on the floor, watching Lucas sleep in the makeshift crib Mrs. Chen had arranged using cushions and blankets. She hadn't slept at all, too afraid that everything would disappear if she closed her eyes. Her stomach cramped with hunger, but she ignored it. She'd gone longer without food before. Christopher found her in the same position when he came to check on them. The sight of her small figure, still wearing yesterday's tattered dress despite the clean clothes Mrs. Chen had left, made something in his chest tighten. "Clara," he said softly, "you need to eat something." She looked up at him, dark circles under her eyes, making her appear even younger and more vulnerable. "Lucas needs formula. He hasn't eaten since yesterday morning." The guilt in her voice was unmistakable, and Christopher felt a surge of anger, not at Clara, but at the circumstances that had forced a 6-year-old to worry about feeding a baby. "Mrs. Chen is preparing a bottle now, but you need to take care of yourself too." Clara's shoulders tensed. "I'm fine, I just need to know what you're going to do with Lucas." Christopher sat down in a nearby chair, trying to appear less intimidating. "I've arranged for a doctor to come this morning. We need to make sure you're both healthy and—" He hesitated. "I've scheduled a DNA test." "You don't believe me?" It wasn't a question. Clara's voice was flat, emotionless, but her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted Lucas's blanket. "I need to know the truth, Clara. And there are laws about these things. I can't just take in 2 children without proper documentation." He watched her carefully. "We also need to talk about your father." Clara's face went pale. "There's nothing to talk about. He's gone." "Gone where? The police will need to—" "No police." Clara's voice cracked with sudden fear. "Please. They'll take Lucas away. They'll put him in the system. Mom said never to let that happen." Christopher leaned forward. "What aren't you telling me, Clara? What happened to your parents?" Before she could answer, Mrs. Chen appeared with a bottle of formula and a plate of breakfast. Clara immediately reached for the bottle, her own food forgotten as she focused on feeding Lucas. Her movements were practiced, maternal in a way that broke Christopher's heart. While Clara fed Lucas, Christopher stepped into the hallway with Mrs. Chen. "What do you think?" he asked quietly. The housekeeper's usually stoic face softened. "That child has seen too much, Mr. Morgan. The way she watches everything, never relaxes. Something very bad happened to her." Christopher nodded, his thoughts returning to the lullaby he'd heard the night before. He'd spent hours researching Sarah Martinez, but found nothing concrete. Yet there was something about Clara that seemed hauntingly familiar. When he returned to the room, Clara had finished feeding Lucas and was attempting to change his diaper with supplies Mrs. Chen had purchased. Her small hands were skilled but shaking with exhaustion. "Let me help," Christopher offered, stepping forward. "No!" Clara's response was sharp, protective. "I can do it. I have to do it." "Why, Clara? Why do you have to do everything alone? She finished changing Lucas before answering, her voice barely a whisper. Because everyone who tries to help ends up leaving. The words hung heavy in the air, filled with unspoken pain. Christopher was about to respond when the doorbell rang. The doctor had arrived. What followed was a tense examination. Clara refused to let the doctor touch Lucas until Christopher promised repeatedly that they wouldn't be separated. The doctor's findings were troubling. Both children were malnourished, Clara had untreated infections in her feet from walking barefoot, and Lucas showed signs of mild dehydration. They need immediate medical attention, the doctor told Christopher privately, and the authorities should be notified. These children have clearly been neglected. Not neglected, Clara's voice came from the doorway, startling them both. I did everything I could. I kept him alive. The doctor's face softened. Of course you did, sweetheart. But where were the adults who should have been helping you? Clara's expression darkened. Dead, or worse. She turned to Christopher, her eyes pleading. You promised no police. You promised he'd be safe. Christopher felt trapped between his moral obligation to report the situation and the raw fear in Clara's eyes. The DNA results will be ready tomorrow, he said finally. We can decide what to do then. But as the day progressed, Clara's condition deteriorated. The infections in her feet, combined with exhaustion and malnutrition, led to a high fever. Still, she refused to let go of Lucas, fighting against Mrs. Chen's attempts to help until she literally collapsed. Christopher had to pry Lucas from her burning hands, watching in alarm as she tried to get up despite her weakness. Have to protect him, she mumbled deliriously. Promised, Mom. Promised. As Mrs. Chen called for an ambulance, Christopher cradled Lucas in one arm while trying to cool Clara's fever with his free hand. The baby stared up at him with eyes that seemed startlingly familiar, while Clara's feverish words became more desperate. Don't let them find us, she pleaded, clutching Christopher's sleeve. Dad will hurt him like he hurt Mom. Can't let them take Lucas to him. Please. Christopher's blood ran cold as the pieces started falling into place. But before he could question Clara further, her eyes rolled back and she went limp in his arms. The sound of approaching sirens filled the air as Christopher made a split-second decision that would change all their lives forever. He couldn't let these children enter the system, not until he knew the whole truth, not until he understood why Clara's desperate plea had awakened something deep in his memory, something he'd spent years trying to forget. The hospital room was eerily quiet, except for the steady beeping of monitors. Christopher sat in an uncomfortable chair, holding Lucas while watching Clara's small form in the hospital bed. She looked even tinier, surrounded by white sheets and medical equipment, her face pale except for the flush of fever on her cheeks. He'd used every connection he had to keep this quiet, to prevent social services from being notified immediately. The hospital staff had been discreet, thanks to his substantial donation to the pediatric wing, but he knew this reprieve was temporary. Soon, he would have to face the consequences of his decision to shield these children from the system. Lucas stirred in his arms, making small whimpering sounds that threatened to become full cries. Christopher instinctively began to rock him, surprising himself with how natural it felt. The baby settled, his tiny hand gripping Christopher's finger with surprising strength. He likes you, came Clara's weak voice from the bed. Christopher looked up to find her watching them, her eyes glassy but alert. He never settles that easily for strangers. How are you feeling? Christopher asked softly, moving closer to her bed. I need to get up. Clara tried to push herself upright, panic flooding her face. Lucas needs me. Lucas is fine, Christopher assured her, gently pressing her back against the pillows. You're the one who needs to rest. The doctor says you have a severe infection and exhaustion. Clara's eyes filled with tears, the first true sign of childlike vulnerability she'd shown. I failed him. Mum told me to keep him safe and I got sick. I'm supposed to be strong. Clara. Christopher's voice was gentle but firm. "You're 6 years old. You've been stronger than anyone should ever have to be. But now it's time to let someone else help you both." She shook her head frantically. "You don't understand. If they find us..." "Who, Clara? Who are you running from?" The heart monitor's beeping increased as Clara's panic rose. "I can't. He'll hurt Lucas like he hurt Mom." "He'll find us in the system. That's why we had to find you. Mom said you were the only one who could protect us." Christopher felt a chill run down his spine. "Your father? Is that who you're afraid of?" Clara's whole body began to tremble. "He's not Lucas's father. You are. Mom told me before." Her voice broke. Before she what, Clara? What happened to your mother?" But Clara had retreated into herself, turning her face away as silent tears rolled down her cheeks. The monitors showed her heart rate climbing dangerously high. A nurse rushed in, alerted by the monitors. "She needs to rest," she said firmly, adjusting Clara's IV. "No more questions right now." Christopher nodded, standing with Lucas still in his arms. "I'll be right outside, Clara. I promise." In the hallway, Christopher paced with Lucas, his mind racing. The DNA results wouldn't be ready until tomorrow, but Clara's words echoed in his head. Could it be possible? And if Lucas wasn't his son, why was Clara so convinced he could protect them? Mrs. Chen arrived with supplies for Lucas and fresh clothes for Clara. Her usually composed face showed signs of worry. "The housekeeper from next door has been asking questions," she reported quietly. "She saw the ambulance. People will start talking soon." Christopher ran a hand through his hair. "I know. But something terrible happened to these children, Mrs. Chen. Something they're still running from. The girl," Mrs. Chen hesitated. "When she was delirious with fever, she said something in Spanish. About blood on the kitchen floor. About her mother not getting up." Christopher felt his heart stop for a moment. A memory stirred. A young woman named Sarah he'd known years ago who worked at one of his first stores. She'd had Clara's same determined eyes. His thoughts were interrupted by a commotion from Clara's room. They rushed back in to find her trying to climb out of bed, fighting against the nurse who tried to restrain her. "He's here!" she screamed, her eyes wild with fever and terror. "I saw him! He found us!" Christopher handed Lucas to Mrs. Chen and rushed to the window. The parking lot below was mostly empty, but he caught a glimpse of a man hurrying away, someone who'd been looking up at Clara's window. Clara's screams had turned to desperate sobs. "Please don't let him take Lucas. Please. Mom died trying to keep us away from him. Please." The nurse administered a mild sedative as Christopher tried to calm Clara. "No one is going to take Lucas," he promised. "You're both safe here." As Clara's sobs quieted and her eyes began to close, she grabbed Christopher's hand with surprising strength. "The box," she whispered, "under the floorboards. Mom said, you have to find it. The proof." Then she was asleep, leaving Christopher with more questions than answers. He stationed a private security guard outside Clara's door and another at the hospital entrance. Whatever was going on, he wouldn't let anyone harm these children. But as night fell, bringing with it a heavy Denver snowstorm, Christopher couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. Tomorrow, the DNA results would come back. Tomorrow, he would have to make decisions that would affect all their lives. And somewhere out there, someone was watching, waiting to destroy the fragile safety he'd built around these children. Looking down at Lucas, who slept peacefully in his arms, Christopher made a silent vow. Whatever the DNA results showed, he wouldn't abandon these children. He couldn't explain it, but something deep inside told him that their lives were now inextricably linked with his own. Mrs. Chen touched his arm gently. "Mr. Morgan, there's something else you should know. When I was changing Clara's clothes at the house, I found this." She handed him a crumpled piece of paper, carefully smoothed out. It was a photograph, worn and creased, showing a much younger Christopher standing with a group of employees at the opening of his first store. And there in the background was a young woman with Clara's eyes, her hand resting protectively over her pregnant belly. The image hit Christopher like a physical blow. He remembered her now, Sarah Martinez, the quiet but hard-working cashier who had disappeared without notice 12 years ago. The same time, his life had taken a very different turn. The same time he'd made a choice he'd spent years trying to forget. The photograph trembled in Christopher's hands as memories flooded back. Sarah Martinez. How could he have forgotten her? She'd been different from his other employees, quiet but determined, always taking extra shifts, always reliable. Until the day she'd simply vanished, leaving nothing but rumors and whispers behind. A soft whimper from Lucas brought him back to the present. The baby's face scrunched up in his sleep, tiny fingers grasping at empty air. Christopher adjusted him gently, and Lucas immediately settled, turning toward the warmth of Christopher's chest. "Mr. Morgan," Mrs. Chen's voice was hesitant. "There's something else. When I was cleaning Clara's old dress, I found this sewn into the hem." She handed him a small key, tarnished and old-fashioned. Christopher stared at it, remembering Clara's fevered words about a box under the floorboards. But before he could respond, a commotion erupted in the hallway. Clara's screams pierced the quiet hospital floor. He rushed into her room, finding her thrashing against the hospital sheets, tears streaming down her face. "Don't hurt her!" she screamed. "Mom! Mom, wake up!" The night nurse tried to hold her down while reaching for a sedative, but Christopher intervened. "Clara," he called softly, taking her small hand in his. "Clara, you're safe. It's just a nightmare." Her eyes flew open, wild with terror, before slowly focusing on his face. "Christopher." Her voice was small, uncertain. Then her gaze landed on Lucas in his other arm, and some of the tension left her body. "It wasn't a nightmare," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It was a memory." Christopher sat carefully on the edge of her bed, still holding her hand. "Do you want to tell me about it?" Clara's free hand twisted in the hospital sheets. "Mom always said we had to be ready to run. She kept a bag packed, hidden in the closet. That night she told me to take Lucas and hide in the cabinet under the sink." Her voice grew distant, as if she was back in that moment. "I could hear them fighting, Mom and him. She told him he'd never find it, never get what he wanted. Then there was a crash, and Mom screamed and—" She started shaking uncontrollably. "Shh," Christopher soothed, squeezing her hand. "You don't have to continue." "Yes, I do," Clara insisted, though tears were streaming down her face. "You need to know, Mom. She didn't get up. There was so much blood on the kitchen floor. I waited in the cabinet with Lucas until I couldn't hear anything anymore. Then I took the emergency bag and ran, just like Mom taught me." Christopher felt sick. "Clara, why didn't you go to the police?" "Mom said never to trust them. She said he had friends there, people who would help him find us. She said only you could help, but I had to convince you Lucas was yours first. She made me memorize your name, your stores, everything about you." "But why me?" Christopher asked softly. "What made your mother trust me so much?" Clara's eyes met his, filled with a wisdom no child should possess. "Because you helped her before when she worked for you. She said you were the only truly good person she knew." The words hit Christopher like a physical blow. He remembered now, remembered Sarah coming to him 12 years ago, clearly terrified but trying to hide it, asking for an advance on her salary. He'd given it to her without question, and the next day she was gone. "Clara," he said carefully, "what was your mother trying to protect? What did she hide that he wanted so badly?" But Clara's energy was fading, her eyes growing heavy. "The box," she murmured, "under the floorboards, in our old house. Mom said, the proof." Her voice trailed off as sleep claimed her again. Christopher sat there for a long time, holding Lucas and watching Clara sleep, his mind racing. The key Mrs. Chen had found suddenly felt heavy in his pocket. A soft knock at the door made him look up. Mrs. Chen entered with a grim expression. "Mr. Morgan, a man was just asking at the nurse's station about Clara and Lucas Martinez. He claimed to be their uncle." Christopher's heart rate spiked. What happened? Security escorted him out, but she hesitated. He was very angry, and he had a police badge. The pieces were starting to fit together, forming a picture that made Christopher's blood run cold. Sarah Martinez had been running from someone powerful, someone with connections. She'd trusted Christopher with her children's safety, but she'd also left something behind, something worth killing for. Looking down at Clara's sleeping face, still marked with tears, Christopher made a decision. He couldn't wait for the DNA results anymore. These children needed more than just protection. They needed answers. "Mrs. Chen, I need you to stay with them. Don't let anyone in except the regular nurses, and call me immediately if anything seems wrong." "Where are you going?" she asked, though her expression suggested she already knew. "To find Sarah Martinez's house. To find that box." As he stood to leave, Clara stirred slightly in her sleep. "Don't leave," she whispered, her voice filled with fear even in unconsciousness. Christopher leaned down and kissed her forehead, a gesture that surprised even him. "I'll be back soon, sweetheart. I promise." But as he walked through the quiet hospital corridors, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into something much bigger and more dangerous than he'd imagined. The weight of the key in his pocket seemed to grow with each step. Outside, the Denver snow was falling harder, covering the city in a thick white blanket that muffled all sound. Christopher started his car, his hands shaking slightly as he gripped the steering wheel. He had no idea where Sarah's house was, but he knew someone who might, his old store manager who'd worked with her all those years ago. As he pulled out of the hospital parking lot, he didn't notice the dark sedan that pulled out behind him, following at a careful distance through the snowy streets, nor did he see the man inside it, speaking quietly into a phone, his police badge catching the dim light of the street lamps as he turned the corner. Back in the hospital room, Clara's eyes flew open suddenly, as if sensing the danger, but this time she didn't scream. Instead, she reached under her pillow and pulled out something she'd kept hidden. A small, worn notebook with a familiar name written on the cover in faded ink, Christopher Morgan. Clara's hands trembled as she opened the worn notebook, her mother's last gift to her. She hadn't shown it to anyone, not even Christopher. The pages were filled with her mother's hurried handwriting, telling a story that Clara was only beginning to understand. She began to read in the dim light of the hospital room, while Mrs. Chen dozed in the chair nearby, still holding Lucas. Meanwhile, Christopher navigated his car through the increasingly treacherous snow-covered streets of Denver. His destination was the modest home of Tom Wheeler, his former store manager who had worked closely with Sarah Martinez. As he drove, his mind kept returning to that time 12 years ago, details surfacing that he'd somehow forgotten. Sarah had been different from the other employees, more reserved, more watchful. She'd work late into the night, counting inventory, always volunteering for extra shifts. He remembered now how she would flinch at sudden movements, how she wore long sleeves even in summer. The signs had been there, but he'd been too focused on building his business empire to really see them. The night she'd come to him for help, her eyes had been wild with fear. She'd asked for an advance on her salary, 3 months' worth. He'd given it to her without question, proud of his generosity. The next day, she was gone. He'd never known what happened to her until now. Tom Wheeler lived in an old craftsman house on the outskirts of the city. As Christopher pulled up, he noticed lights still on despite the late hour. He trudged through the snow to the front door and knocked, stamping his feet to stay warm. The door opened to reveal Tom, older and grayer than Christopher remembered, but with the same sharp eyes. "I knew you'd come eventually," he said without preamble. "I saw the news about the hospital, about the children." Christopher's blood ran cold. "It's in the news?" Tom stepped aside to let him in. "Not exactly, but there are people asking questions. The wrong people." Inside, Tom's house was cluttered but warm. Photos covered the walls, many from the early days of Christopher's first store. And there, in several of them, was Sarah Martinez. "You knew," Christopher said, his voice tight. "You knew about Sarah all this time." Tom sank heavily into an armchair. "I knew some things, not everything. Sarah trusted me, but she was careful. She had to be." "What happened to her, Tom?" "The truth. She was married to a cop named Marcus Reeves. Bad news from the start. Abusive, controlling, but it was more than that." Tom's voice dropped. "She found something, evidence of corruption. Marcus and some other officers were involved in something big. When she threatened to expose them, things got ugly." Christopher's hands clenched into fists. "And I gave her the money to run." "You did more than that," Tom said quietly. "Though you might not remember. The night before she disappeared, you stayed late at the store. Sarah was there crying in the break room. You talked to her for hours." The memory hit Christopher like a physical blow. Sarah, her face streaked with tears, showing him papers she'd found, evidence of police corruption, money laundering, worse. He'd advised her to go to internal affairs, but she'd been terrified. Marcus had connections everywhere. "I told her to run," Christopher whispered. "I gave her names of people who could help her disappear." Tom nodded. "You also gave her hope. She never forgot that. But why didn't she come to me directly now? Why send Clara with this story about Lucas being my son?" "Because Sarah knew they were still watching you. She knew if she contacted you directly, they'd know immediately. But a lost little girl, who would suspect?" Christopher's mind raced. The box Clara mentioned, under the floorboards. "Do you know where Sarah lived?" Tom wrote an address on a piece of paper. "Be careful, Christopher. The people involved in this. They've only gotten more powerful over the years." As Christopher stood to leave, Tom grabbed his arm. "There's something else you should know. Sarah, she wasn't just running to protect herself. She was running to protect you too." Back at the hospital, Clara read through her mother's notebook with growing understanding. The pages told a story of corruption and betrayal, but also of kindness and hope. Her mother had written about Christopher extensively, about his generosity, his integrity, and most importantly, about what he'd done the night everything changed. "He gave me a chance to escape," Sarah had written, "but more than that, he gave me the courage to fight back. Everything I gathered, all the evidence, it's not just for justice anymore. It's to protect the one person who showed me real kindness when I needed it most." Clara looked up as Lucas stirred in Mrs. Chen's arms. Her brother's face, so innocent and trusting, reminded her of everything that was at stake. She turned to the last page of the notebook where her mother's final message was written. "Clara, my brave girl, if you're reading this, then something has happened to me. The box contains everything, all the evidence, all the names, but most importantly, it contains the truth about that night at the store. The night Christopher Morgan saved not just my life, but yours too. He doesn't remember everything. They made sure of that, but the proof is there. Find him, show him. He's the only one strong enough to finish what I started." A noise in the hallway made Clara snap the notebook shut. Through the door's window, she saw a man in a police uniform talking to the nurses. Her heart began to race as she recognized him. The same man who had been watching her window earlier. Mrs. Chen had woken up and was watching the door with growing concern. "Clara," she whispered, "is that him? Is that the man you're afraid of?" Clara shook her head. "No," she whispered back, "but he works for him, for Marcus." She clutched the notebook to her chest, her mother's words echoing in her mind. Everything depended on Christopher finding that box, but first he had to survive the night, because Clara knew something she hadn't told anyone yet, something her mother had written in the notebook's final pages. The real reason Marcus had killed her mother wasn't just about police corruption. It was about Christopher Morgan, and a night 12 years ago that had changed everything. A night that had left Christopher with a gap in his memories, and Marcus Reeves with a burning desire for revenge. Outside the hospital, the snow continued to fall, covering Christopher's tracks as he drove towards Sarah's old house. Behind him, two more dark sedans joined the first, their headlights cutting through the storm like predators' eyes in the night. The old Victorian house loomed before Christopher, its weathered facade barely visible through the thickening snow. This was where Sarah Martinez had lived her last days, where Clara had hidden under a sink, clutching her baby brother while their mother's life ebbed away on the kitchen floor. His hands shook as he approached the front door, noticing immediately that it was slightly ajar. Inside, the house was a tomb of memories. Dust covered everything, and the air held the heavy stillness of long abandonment. Christopher's flashlight beam revealed signs of the life that had once filled these rooms. Faded children's drawings still taped to the walls, a small table with 3 chairs, one tipped over as if someone had left in a hurry. The kitchen made him pause. Despite the years that had passed, he could still see a darker stain on the floor where Sarah had fallen. Clara's words echoed in his mind. Mom didn't get up. His throat tightened with emotion and rage at what this family had endured. As he moved through the house, more memories began to surface, memories he hadn't known were buried in his mind. That night at the store 12 years ago hadn't been just a simple conversation with a frightened employee. Sarah had shown him documents, photographs, evidence of corruption that went far beyond a few crooked cops. She'd trusted him with information that could have brought down half the police department. But something had happened after that night, something that had left him with headaches and gaps in his memory whenever he tried to think about it too hard. Tom's words came back to him. They made sure you didn't remember. Upstairs, he found what must have been Clara's room. A small bed with faded princess sheets was pushed against one wall. On a shelf, carefully arranged, sat a collection of second-hand books, all well-worn and clearly loved. One was open to a page where a child had carefully practiced writing. Clara Morgan. The sight made his heart clench. Even then, Clara had been holding on to hope of a connection with him. But why? What was the real truth that Sarah had taken to her grave? In what had been Sarah's bedroom, Christopher found more signs of a life lived in constant fear. Multiple locks on the door, a bag still packed with emergency supplies. And there, in the corner, he noticed something odd about the floorboards. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Clara was facing her own crisis. The man in the police uniform had convinced the night nurse to let him in for just a few questions. Now he stood in the doorway, his badge glinting under the fluorescent lights. "Hello, Clara," he said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "I'm Officer Jenkins. I worked with your father." Clara's grip on the notebook tightened. Mrs. Chen had positioned herself between the officer and Lucas, her usually calm demeanor replaced by fierce protectiveness. "My father is dead to me," Clara said, her voice stronger than she felt. "And you can tell Marcus that he'll never find what he's looking for." Jenkins's smile disappeared. Such a brave little girl. But bravery won't protect your brother or Christopher Morgan. You know what happens to people who cross Marcus Reeves. "Mr. Morgan has powerful friends," Mrs. Chen interrupted, "and this is a private hospital room." "Mr. Morgan's friends won't help him tonight," Jenkins replied coldly. "Not where he's going." Clara's blood ran cold as she realized what he meant. They knew where Christopher was. They'd followed him. Back at the house, Christopher had managed to pry up the loose floorboards. There, wrapped in plastic, was a metal box. Old but solid, with a simple keyhole that matched the key Mrs. Chen had found in Clara's dress. His hands trembled as he lifted it out. This was what Sarah had died protecting. This was what Clara had been trying to deliver along with her brother. But before he could insert the key, he heard the crunch of tires on snow outside. Moving quickly to the window, he saw 3 dark sedans parked on the street. Men were getting out, their movements purposeful. He recognized one of them immediately, Marcus Reeves, older than in the photos Sarah had shown him years ago, but still carrying himself with the same dangerous authority. The memories were flooding back now, breaking through whatever barrier had been placed in his mind. That night at the store, Sarah hadn't just shown him evidence. She'd shown him something else, something that had made him promise to protect her and her unborn child at any cost. Christopher looked down at the box in his hands, suddenly understanding why Sarah had trusted him so completely. Why Clara had been so certain he would help them. The truth wasn't just about police corruption, it was about him. He could hear footsteps on the porch now. In moments, they would be inside. His mind raced, searching for an escape route. But as he heard the front door crash open downstairs, he realized he might not make it out of this house. At the hospital, Clara had made a decision. She opened the notebook to its final pages and began to read aloud, her voice carrying clearly across the room. "The night Christopher Morgan helped me escape, he gave me more than money and hope," she read, her eyes locked on Officer Jenkins. "He gave me the truth about who Marcus really was and what he'd done to other women who had threatened to expose him. But most importantly, Christopher gave me a DNA test result." Jenkins took a step forward, but Mrs. Chen blocked his path. Clara continued reading, her voice growing stronger. "The test proved what I had suspected since the day I met Christopher Morgan. The day I saw him working alongside his employees, treating everyone with kindness and respect. The day I recognized his eyes, the same eyes I saw every morning in my mirror, the same eyes my daughter Clara would inherit." Clara looked up from the notebook, tears streaming down her face. "Christopher Morgan isn't Lucas's father," she said quietly. "He's mine." The revelation hung in the air like a physical thing. Jenkins' face contorted with understanding and rage. Because now he knew what was in the box Christopher was trying to retrieve. Not just evidence of police corruption, but proof of a connection that would give Christopher Morgan every reason to bring Marcus Reeves down. Proof that Marcus had spent 12 years trying to erase, along with any memory Christopher had of discovering his long-lost daughter that night at the store. In the old Victorian house, Christopher stood in Sarah's bedroom, holding the box that contained the truth about his past. As footsteps thundered up the stairs, he finally remembered everything. The DNA test, the recognition, the promise he'd made to protect his daughter and her unborn brother. And he remembered something else, something Sarah had shown him about this house, something about a secret way out. As Marcus Reeves reached the top of the stairs, Christopher's fingers found what he was looking for, a hidden latch that opened a panel in the wall, revealing a narrow passage to the attached garage. Sarah had planned for everything, including this moment. But would her final safeguard be enough to help him escape with the truth? And would Clara survive long enough at the hospital for him to prove it? The narrow passage in the wall was pitch black and thick with dust, forcing Christopher to feel his way forward while clutching the metal box to his chest. Every step creaked beneath his feet, threatening to give away his location to the men searching the house. His heart pounded so loudly he was sure they would hear it, but the sound was drowned out by Marcus Reeves's voice, booming through the old house. "Morgan, you can't hide from me forever. 12 years I've waited to finish what I started that night. 12 years of watching you build your perfect life while I cleaned up Sarah's mess." Christopher's fingers brushed against cold metal, a ladder leading down to the garage. Sarah had planned this escape route meticulously, just as she'd planned everything else, including, he now realized, the moment Clara would find him, his daughter. The thought made his chest tight with a mixture of love and grief. How had he forgotten her? What had they done to make him forget his own child? At the hospital, Clara sat rigid in her bed, still holding the notebook like a shield. Officer Jenkins had backed toward the door, speaking urgently into his radio. "Mrs. Chen stood protectively in front of Lucas's makeshift crib, her normally gentle face set in determined lines. "You're lying," Jenkins said, but his voice held a note of uncertainty. Marcus said Christopher Morgan never knew about the girl. He made sure of it. Made sure how? Clara demanded, her voice stronger than she felt. By hurting him like he hurt my mom. By making him forget. She turned to a specific page in the notebook. Mom wrote it all down. How Marcus and his friends drugged Christopher at his store that night. How they used something to make him forget everything he'd learned. The memory of that night was burning in Christopher's mind as he carefully descended the ladder. He remembered now. Remembered Sarah showing him the DNA results, remembered the joy and shock of discovering he had a daughter, remembered making plans to help them escape, to bring Marcus down, to make up for all the years he'd lost. Then pain, darkness. Waking up days later with a gap in his memories and a strange reluctance to question why Sarah Martinez had disappeared. The garage was dark and cold, but Christopher could see a faint outline of light around what appeared to be a normal wall. His fingers found another hidden latch, and a section of the wall swung outward into the snowy night. Sarah had created an escape route right under Marcus's nose, but as he stepped out into the snow, a figure emerged from the shadows. Tom Wheeler stood there, his face a mask of regret. "I'm sorry, Christopher," he said quietly, "but I can't let you leave with that box." Christopher stumbled backward, betrayal hitting him like a physical blow. "You? You've been working with Marcus all this time?" "Not all this time. Just since Sarah threatened to expose everything, Marcus offered me a choice, help him or lose everything. I chose to survive." Tom's eyes flickered to the box. "Just like you chose to forget." "I didn't choose anything," Christopher growled. "You helped them drug me. You helped them take my daughter away." "It was better that way," Tom insisted. "You were building something important. A daughter you never knew existed? A scandal involving corrupt cops? It would have destroyed everything." At the hospital, Clara was still reading from her mother's notebook, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Mom wrote about the night she discovered who my real father was. She'd been working late at the store, doing inventory. She cut her hand on a box cutter, and Christopher insisted on driving her to the emergency room. They got to talking about their lives, their families. Mom mentioned that she'd never known her father, that her mother had died without telling her the truth." Clara's eyes met Jenkins', fierce and unafraid. Christopher told her about a relationship he'd had years before when he was young and struggling to start his business. About how the woman had disappeared without telling him she was pregnant, how he'd always wondered. Jenkins' hand moved toward his weapon, but Mrs. Chen's voice cut through the tension. "The DNA test proved it, didn't it? That's what's in the box Christopher's looking for. Not just evidence against Marcus, but proof that Clara is his daughter." In the snowy darkness behind Sarah's house, Christopher faced Tom Wheeler, the weight of betrayal heavy in his chest. "You knew. All these years you knew I had a daughter. I was protecting you," Tom insisted. "Marcus would have destroyed you. He'd already killed others who threatened to expose him. I couldn't watch that happen to you. So instead, you helped him erase my memories. Helped him hunt down Sarah, let my daughter grow up without a father." Christopher's voice cracked with emotion. "Clara spent years on the streets, protecting her baby brother, while I lived in ignorance in my big empty house." Tom's face twisted with shame. "I never knew he would kill Sarah. I thought he just wanted her quiet. When I heard what happened, it was too late." "It's not too late now," Christopher said quietly. "Help me make this right, Tom. Help me protect my daughter." For a moment, Tom seemed to waver. Then his expression hardened. "I'm sorry, Christopher, but I've come too far to back out now." He reached into his coat. But before he could withdraw whatever weapon he was reaching for, a sharp voice cut through the snowy night. "Drop it, Tom!" Mrs. Chen stood at the corner of the garage, holding what appeared to be a small revolver. Behind her was Clara's doctor from the hospital and several large men who were definitely not hospital staff. "When Clara showed me the notebook," Mrs. Chen said calmly, "I called some old friends. Turns out I'm not the only one who's been watching out for Sarah Martinez's children all these years. From inside the house came the sounds of struggle and shouting. The doctor smiled grimly. That would be the FBI finally moving in. We've been building a case against Marcus Reeves for years. Just needed someone brave enough to provide proof. Tom's shoulders slumped in defeat. The weapon he withdrew from his coat was actually Sarah's old store ID badge. She was wearing this the night everything changed, he said quietly, holding it out to Christopher. I've carried it ever since, as a reminder of my cowardice. Christopher took the badge with trembling hands. In the photo, Sarah was smiling, her hand resting protectively over her pregnant belly. She'd known even then, he realized, known that her daughter would one day need her father. But as sirens began to wail in the distance, Christopher's relief was shattered by the sound of gunshots from the hospital. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. You may have won, Morgan, but how much are you willing to lose to keep that box? Come alone to the hospital roof. Now. The message was accompanied by a photo that made Christopher's blood run cold. Clara and Lucas being held at gunpoint by Officer Jenkins. The truth was finally out. Justice was finally being served. But the night's darkest hour was not yet over. And Christopher's newfound family hung in the balance. The hospital service elevator groaned as it climbed toward the roof, carrying Christopher and the weight of 12 years of buried truths. The metal box was clutched against his chest, its contents now clear but somehow less important than the two children waiting above. His children, a daughter he'd forgotten and a son he'd grown to love despite knowing the truth about his parentage. The FBI agents had wanted to stop him from going alone, but Christopher had seen the coldness in Jenkins' eyes in that photo. The man had nothing left to lose. One wrong move, and both Clara and Lucas would pay the price. As the elevator neared the top floor, Christopher's mind raced back through the events that had led to this moment. Sarah's careful planning, Clara's incredible bravery, and the remarkable strength both mother and daughter had shown in protecting not just themselves, but him as well. He couldn't fail them now. The roof access door was already open when he arrived, letting in the swirling snow and bitter cold. Jenkins stood near the edge, one arm holding Lucas, while the other gripped Clara's shoulder. Both children were wrapped in hospital blankets, but Christopher could see them shivering. Let them go, Jenkins, Christopher said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. It's over. The FBI has Marcus. Tom confessed everything. Over? Jenkins laughed, but there was a desperate edge to it. Nothing's over until Marcus says it is, and right now, all he wants is that box, and maybe a little revenge. Clara's eyes met Christopher's, and he saw in them not fear, but determination. She was so much like her mother. Like him too, he realized, in her quiet strength and unflinching courage. You know what's in this box? Christopher asked, taking a careful step forward. Not just evidence against Marcus, not just proof of corruption. There's a DNA test in here, Jenkins. Proof that Clara is my daughter. I know all about your long-lost daughter story. Jenkins spat. Marcus told us how Sarah tried to con you with that lie 12 years ago. How she doctored some tests to try to blackmail you. Is that what he told you? Christopher's voice was soft now. Did he also tell you about the other tests? The ones Clara's mother ran on herself, years before she ever met me? The ones that proved Marcus had been drugging her, making her forget things, just like he did to me? Jenkins's grip on Clara loosened slightly. What are you talking about? Sarah wasn't just some random employee in my store, Christopher continued, taking another slow step. She was investigating Marcus long before she knew who I was. She was building a case, gathering evidence, but then she discovered something else, something in her own medical records that led her to me. Clara spoke up, her voice clear despite her shivering. Mum found out she was adopted. She found her birth mother's records. She was looking for her real father when she started working at the store. Christopher nodded. Sarah didn't know at first, but she noticed things. The way we had the same mannerisms, the same eyes. When she cut her hand that night at the store and I drove her to the emergency room, we got talking about our families, about how I'd had a relationship years before with a woman who disappeared without telling me she was pregnant. Understanding began to dawn on Jenkins's face. Sarah's mother was the woman I'd loved and lost in my youth, Christopher confirmed. She never told me she was pregnant, never told Sarah who her father was. But Sarah figured it out, and when she did, she realized she'd found not just her father, but an ally in her fight against Marcus. Clara's voice trembled as she continued the story. But Marcus found out. He couldn't let Mom expose him, and he couldn't let her tell Christopher the truth. So he hurt them both, made them forget each other. The drugs they used, Christopher said, his voice hardening. They didn't just make me forget about Sarah's evidence, they made me forget my own daughter. 12 years of memories, buried under whatever chemicals Marcus and his friends forced into me that night at the store. Jenkins was shaking now, his grip on the children becoming unsteady. Marcus said it was just business, just keeping things quiet. He never said, never told us, that he'd torn apart a family. Christopher took another step closer. That he'd forced a father to forget his own child? That he'd driven a young mother to such desperation that she'd rather die than let him hurt her children again? Lucas began to cry, the sound cutting through the snowy night like a knife. Clara reached for her brother instinctively, and Jenkins's grip loosened further. It wasn't supposed to be like this, Jenkins whispered. We were just supposed to keep order. Keep things quiet. By hurting children, Christopher's voice was thick with emotion. By making a 6-year-old girl live on the streets, protecting her baby brother because everyone who should have protected her was either dead or couldn't remember her. Clara's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained strong. Mom never gave up. Even when she was dying, she made sure I knew the truth, made sure I could find my way to my father. Christopher was close enough now to see the conflict in Jenkins' eyes. It's not too late to do the right thing. Marcus is finished. Don't add the death of 2 innocent children to his crimes. For a moment, the only sound was the wind and Lucas's quiet sobs. Then Jenkins looked down at the children, really looked at them, and something in his face changed. I have kids too, he said quietly. I never thought about... His arms fell to his sides, releasing Clara and Lucas. Clara immediately grabbed her brother and ran to Christopher, who dropped to his knees to embrace them both. The box clattered to the roof, forgotten in the moment of reunion. Jenkins stood at the edge of the roof, watching them with a look of profound regret. I'm sorry, he said simply, then turned and walked toward the roof access door, where FBI agents were already emerging with weapons drawn. Christopher held his children close, feeling Clara's tears soaking into his shirt and Lucas's tiny hands clutching at his collar. After 12 years of forgotten memories and buried truths, after all the pain and loss and separation, they were finally together. But as the FBI agents led Jenkins away and more emergency personnel flooded onto the roof, Christopher noticed something that made his blood run cold. Clara was looking past him, her eyes wide with terror. He turned just in time to see a figure emerging from the shadows near the helicopter pad. Marcus Reeves stood there, having somehow escaped the raid at Sarah's house. In his hand was a gun, and his face was twisted with a hatred that had festered for 12 long years. How touching, he sneered. The family reunion I tried so hard to prevent, but I'm afraid your happy ending will have to wait. We have some unfinished business, Morgan. Christopher pushed the children behind him, facing the man who had stolen so much from them all. The final confrontation was about to begin, and this time there would be no forgotten memories, no buried truths. This time, everyone would remember everything. The snow swirled around them on the hospital roof, the wind carrying away the sounds of sirens and shouting from below. Christopher stood firmly between his children and Marcus Reeves, his mind crystal clear for the first time in 12 years. Every buried memory, every forgotten moment had returned, bringing with them a strength he didn't know he possessed. "It's over, Marcus," Christopher said quietly, his voice carrying over the wind. "The FBI has your associates. Jenkins is in custody. The evidence in that box will put you away for life." Marcus's laugh was hollow, empty of everything except bitterness. "Evidence? You think I care about evidence anymore?" His gun hand was steady, but his eyes held the dangerous gleam of a man with nothing left to lose. 12 years I spent watching you, Morgan. Watching you build your perfect life, while I cleaned up the mess Sarah made. While I lived with the knowledge that one little girl could bring it all crashing down. Behind Christopher, Clara held Lucas close, shielding her brother's eyes from what was happening. But her own gaze was fixed on Marcus, studying him with a wisdom far beyond her years. "You were afraid of her," Clara said suddenly, her voice clear and strong. "Not just of what she knew, but of who she was. Because Mom was good and honest. Everything you'd stopped being. She reminded you of who you used to be before you became this." Marcus's hand trembled slightly. "Shut up. You're just like her, always thinking you understand everything. Sarah thought she could change things, make everything right. Look where that got her." "She did change things," Christopher said firmly. "She protected our daughter. She made sure Clara would find me, that the truth would come out, even after everything you did to stop it." "The truth?" Marcus spat. "You want the truth, Morgan? The truth is that Sarah Martinez was nothing but trouble from the start, poking around where she didn't belong, threatening to expose things she didn't understand. When we found out she was your daughter, it was almost too perfect, two birds, one stone." Christopher's heart clenched at the casual cruelty in Marcus's voice. "You drugged me, made me forget my own child." "It was easy," Marcus sneered. "You were so trusting, so concerned about your employees' welfare. All it took was one cup of coffee and 12 years of your life disappeared. But Sarah, she was harder to handle. She kept fighting, kept digging. Even after we took her memories, something in her kept pushing her to look for answers." Clara's voice shook with emotion. "She remembered enough to know you were dangerous, enough to keep us safe from you." "Safe?" Marcus laughed again, the sound brittle in the cold air. "Is that what you call living on the streets, hiding in shelters, running every time we got close?" "Better than letting you hurt us," Clara shot back. "Better than letting you win." Christopher took a careful step forward, drawing Marcus's attention back to him. "You've lost, Marcus. Even if you kill us all right now, the truth is already out. The FBI has everything. The evidence of corruption, the proof of what you did to Sarah, to me, to these children. Then I have nothing left to lose, do I?" Marcus's finger tightened on the trigger. "Except the satisfaction of watching you lose everything, just like I did." What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. As Marcus raised his gun, several things occurred simultaneously. The roof access door burst open as FBI agents finally reached them. Clara screamed a warning, and Mrs. Chen, who had quietly emerged from behind the helicopter pad, swung a heavy medical tray with surprising strength, striking Marcus's arm. The gun went off, the shot going wide, and Marcus stumbled. Christopher lunged forward, tackling him away from the roof's edge. They grappled in the snow, years of buried rage and pain fueling their struggle. "You took everything from me," Christopher growled, pinning Marcus down. "My memories, my daughter, years I can never get back." Marcus's face was contorted with hatred. "She would have ruined everything, just like her mother tried to ruin me. I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't." His voice trailed off as he noticed something behind Christopher. Clara had stepped forward, holding the metal box that contained all the evidence against him. But it wasn't the box that made Marcus go pale. It was what Clara held in her other hand. Sarah's notebook was open to a page near the end, and Clara began to read, her voice carrying across the roof. "My dearest Clara, if you're reading this, then my worst fears have come true. But there's something you need to know about Marcus Reeves, something even he has forgotten. Before he became what he is now, he was a good man. He was your father's partner in the police academy, his best friend, the man who stood beside him at his wedding to your grandmother. Christopher's grip on Marcus loosened in shock. The memories were flooding back now, not just of Sarah and Clara, but from even further back. Marcus, younger and laughing, helping him through academy training, standing beside him at his wedding to Sarah's mother, being there when she disappeared, pregnant with the child who would grow up to be Sarah. "You were my friend," Christopher whispered. "You knew all along who Sarah was, who Clara was. They were your family too." Marcus's resistance crumbled, his face crumpling with decades of suppressed guilt. "I didn't know at first," he choked out. "When Sarah started investigating me, I didn't make the connection. But then she found those adoption records, started asking questions about her mother, about you. And I realized I'd been hunting my best friend's daughter, my goddaughter." Clara continued reading, tears streaming down her face. "Mom wrote that the real tragedy wasn't what you did to her or to Christopher. It was what you did to yourself. How you buried your own memories, your own conscience, until you couldn't remember who you used to be." FBI agents surrounded them now, but no one moved to intervene. This moment of truth had been 12 years in the making. "I couldn't face it," Marcus whispered. "Couldn't face what I'd become. It was easier to make everyone forget, to make myself forget." Christopher stood slowly, helping Marcus to his feet. "But we remember now, all of us, and we have to live with that truth." As the agents led Marcus away, Christopher turned to his children. Clara stood tall despite her tears, still protecting Lucas, still showing the strength that had gotten them through so much. He walked to them and knelt in the snow, opening his arms. Clara fell into his embrace, finally allowing herself to be a child again. Lucas squirmed between them, not understanding everything but knowing he was safe, loved, part of a family at last. Mrs. Chen watched with tears in her eyes as hospital staff arrived to check on the children. The snow was letting up, and the first light of dawn was breaking over Denver's skyline. 3 months later, Christopher stood in the doorway of Clara's new room, watching her read to Lucas. The walls were painted her favorite shade of blue, covered with bookshelves and family photos, new ones, creating memories to fill the 12-year void. Sarah's notebook sat on Clara's bedside table, no longer a burden of secrets, but a testament to a mother's love and courage. The metal box that had caused so much pain was locked away in an FBI evidence room, its contents having helped bring justice not just to Marcus, but to all those his corruption had hurt. Marcus Reeves had pleaded guilty to all charges, his confession bringing closure to dozens of families beyond just Christopher's. In the end, remembering who he had once been had broken through decades of darkness. "Dad?" Clara's voice brought Christopher back to the present. "Will you tell us a story? About Mom? About what she was like when you first met her?" Christopher smiled and sat on the edge of her bed. Lucas immediately crawled into his lap, and Clara curled up beside them both. "Your mother," he began, his voice warm with love and memory, "was the bravest person I've ever known, and she gave me the greatest gifts possible. She gave me back my memories, my conscience, and most importantly, she gave me both of you." And as Christopher told stories of Sarah's courage and kindness, of the love that had survived even when memories were stolen, he looked at his children and felt complete. The truth had cost them all dearly, but it had also set them free. Free to remember, free to love, free to be the family they were always meant to be. Outside, Denver's spring flowers were beginning to bloom, covering the city in new life. And in a small bedroom filled with love and stories, a father and his children held onto each other, making up for lost time, creating new memories to replace the ones that had been stolen. They were finally home, finally together, and nothing would ever make them forget again.